On November 18th, 2 days after Phoenix was brutally murdered, her killer called 999 and calmly told the operator, "I had a psychotic break and killed my wife."
Somebody had said to me, if God came to you and said, "I'm going to give you this beautiful daughter, but you'll only have her for 18 years, and then we need to take her back, would you still want her?" And I would take those 18 years and go through the pain rather than have nothing. And although just now that probably offers no words of comfort for Phoenix's parents, maybe one day it can.
On the morning of August 13th, 2018, a man stood on his front lawn in Frederick, Colorado, talking to a local news camera. He looked calm, almost too calm. His pregnant wife had been missing since the night before, and he was doing a TV interview, asking the public for help finding her. He said he just wanted his family back home. He cried on cue. He even pulled out his phone mid-interview to show the reporter a photo of his daughters, Bella, 4 years old, and Celeste, 3. What the cameras didn't know, what nobody standing on that quiet suburban street could have imagined, was that while this man was performing grief for the evening news, his wife and both of his little girls were already dead, and he knew exactly where the bodies were, because he put them there. This is the story of Chris Watts, a story about a picture-perfect American family that was hiding something rotten underneath the surface. A story about obsession, manipulation, and a man who decided that the easiest way out of his problems was to make his entire family disappear. Buckle up, because this one is going to shake you. Frederick, Colorado is the kind of town that looks like it was pulled straight out of a stock photo. Clean streets, nice yards, neighbors who wave at each other. It's the kind of place where people move when they want the American dream. The house, the dog, the minivan, the whole deal. That's exactly what Chris and Shanann Watts seem to have. Chris, 33, worked as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum. Decent paying job, stable, respectable. He was quiet, soft-spoken, the kind of guy people describe as nice without being able to say much else. He worked out a lot. He drove a nice truck. He didn't make waves. Shanann, 34, was the opposite in the best possible way. She was electric, a social media presence, a Thrive nutritional supplement seller with thousands of followers, and a mom who documented every moment of her family's life online. She posted videos of date nights, Bella and Celeste playing in the backyard, and family road trips. Her page was basically a highlight reel of love and happiness. To the outside world, they were goals. But here's the thing nobody talks about when they describe the perfect family. The outside world only sees what you let them see. And behind those Instagram posts, there were cracks forming that were about to split everything wide open. Let's rewind a little, because context is everything here. Chris and Shanann had been married since 2012. They'd had their financial struggles. Real bad ones, actually. They filed for bankruptcy in 2015. Between the mortgage, the kids, the car payments, and Shanann's Thrive business, money was tight in ways that put serious stress on a marriage. But by 2018, Shanann was pregnant again, this time with a boy they were going to name Nico. She announced it on Facebook, because that's how Shanann did everything. Openly, joyfully, and with the whole world watching. What Shanann didn't announce was that her marriage was in serious trouble. That summer, she had taken Bella and Celeste to North Carolina to visit her parents for 6 weeks. 6 weeks apart. And while she was gone, Chris wasn't sitting home lonely and sad. He had met someone. Her name was Nicole Kessinger, a coworker, and Chris fell hard. We're talking 5-hour phone calls, constant texting, making future plans kind of hard. He told her things weren't working out with Shanann. He may have even implied he was already separated. Now here's the psychological twist. And this is the part that really gets under your skin. Chris Watts was not a dramatic guy. He wasn't someone who argued loudly or threw things or stormed out of rooms. He was passive, a people pleaser. He spent years going along with whatever Shanann wanted because confrontation made him uncomfortable. But inside, he was building a pressure cooker of resentment. Psychologists call it nice guy syndrome, and it's more dangerous than it sounds. When someone never expresses frustration honestly, when they keep swallowing their feelings and putting on a smile, that energy doesn't just disappear. It festers, it warps, and when it finally explodes, it doesn't come out as an argument. It comes out as something far worse. On Sunday, August 12th, 2018, Shanann flew home from a work trip in Arizona. It was close to 2 a.m. by the time she got back to the house in Frederick. Chris picked her up from the airport. Quiet ride home by all accounts. When they got inside, they talked. Or tried to. Shanann had figured out that something was off with Chris. Weeks of weird behavior, emotional distance, him acting like a stranger in his own house. She wanted answers. What happened next, in the early morning hours of August 13th, is something only one person knows the full truth of. And that person is Chris Watts. What we know from evidence and his own confessions, which changed multiple times, is that sometime between 2 and 4 a.m., Chris Watts strangled his pregnant wife Shanann to death in their bed. Then he went into his daughter's rooms, Bella and Celeste, 4 and 3 years old, asleep in their beds, probably dreaming about whatever little kids dream about. He killed them too. Then, and this is the part that breaks people, he loaded their bodies into his work truck and drove out to a remote oilworks site owned by Anadarko, his employer. He buried Shanann in a shallow grave near the property. And Bella and Celeste? He submerged them in oil storage tanks, his daughters, in oil tanks. He was back home before sunrise. By the time Shanann's friend Nicole Atkinson came to check on her, worried after Shanann missed an important doctor's appointment, Chris was mowing his lawn. Just mowing his lawn. Nicole Atkinson is honestly one of the unsung heroes of this case. When Shanann didn't answer texts or phone calls and missed her OB appointment, Nicole didn't shrug it off. She drove to the house. She called the cops. She pushed. When police arrived, Chris let them in without much resistance. He was cooperative, helpful even. He said Shanann and the girls were gone when he woke up, that they'd had an argument the night before about the future of their marriage, and he assumed she'd taken the kids and left. A classic misdirect. But investigators weren't buying it. Here's why. Everything was wrong. Shanann's car was still in the garage. Her purse, her keys, her phone, all still in the house. What kind of woman packs up her kids at 2 a.m. and walks out without her phone or car? A pregnant woman? Nobody. And then there was Chris himself. Law enforcement and behavioral analysts will tell you that when a spouse goes missing under suspicious circumstances, the other partner's behavior is often the loudest piece of evidence in the room. Most people in that situation are an absolute wreck. Frantic, desperate. Chris Watts was not frantic. He wasn't desperate. He was measured, controlled. A little too put together for a man whose pregnant wife and 2 little girls had supposedly vanished into thin air overnight. The TV interview he gave that morning, the one where he cried, was studied later by body language experts who flagged it as one of the most textbook examples of fake distress they'd ever seen on camera. He smiled at certain moments. His tears looked forced. And most tellingly, when he talked about his daughters versus when he talked about Shanann, his emotional response was wildly inconsistent. Meanwhile, detectives were quietly pulling phone records, and what they found in those records blew the grieving husband narrative to pieces. Chris Watts had been on the phone with Nickel Kessinger for hours on the very night Shanann disappeared. Not before. During. That call started around 11 p.m., right around the time Shanann had come home. The picture was getting clearer by the hour. On August 15th, 2 days after Shanann disappeared, investigators sat Chris down for a formal interview. They told him, truthfully, that they had surveillance footage from a neighbor's camera showing his work truck leaving the house early that morning with something in the bed. Something that hadn't been there when he arrived home. Chris cracked, but not the way you'd expect. Instead of confessing to everything, he offered up a story so cold-blooded, so calculating, that the detectives in the room reportedly went silent. Chris told them that he had woken up that morning and watched through a baby monitor as Shanann, his wife, was strangling their daughters. He said he'd gone in, found the girls, and in a fit of rage over what he'd just witnessed, he strangled Shanann. He tried to blame a dead woman, a dead pregnant woman, for the murders of the children he killed. Let that sink in for a second. It was a lie so vile that even hardened investigators were stunned, and it didn't hold up for even a few hours. The autopsy evidence made it immediately clear that both girls had died in the same manner as Shanann, and that the timeline Chris was spinning was physically impossible. By August 16th, 3 days after that TV appearance, Chris Watts was arrested, and that afternoon, investigators found the bodies at the Anadarko worksite, guided there by cell phone data and surveillance footage that had quietly tracked every move Chris had made. This is the question that haunts every person who hears this case, because Chris Watts wasn't some street criminal with a history of violence. He was a suburban dad with a mortgage and a fantasy football team and a favorite fast food order. How does someone go from that to this? Criminal psychologists who studied the case talk about a phenomenon called family annihilation, and it's more common than most people want to believe. It typically involves a man who feels trapped, not trapped by bars and chains, but by the idea of his life. The house, the wife, the kids, the job, it all starts to feel like a cage. And when he discovers a way out in this case, Nickel Kessinger, the family stops feeling like people he loves and starts feeling like obstacles. That dehumanization is what makes the violence possible. Add in the deep conflict avoidance, the years of stuffed-down feelings, the sudden rush of attention from a new woman, and the financial pressure that had been squeezing that household for years. And you've got a psychological profile that, while not excusing anything, not even close, does explain how an ordinary man convinced himself to do an unthinkable thing. Power and control are funny things. They don't always look like a guy screaming and throwing furniture. Sometimes they look like a quiet man in a nice house who just decided one day that he was the only person in his family whose future mattered. In November 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to 9 counts, including 3 counts of first-degree murder for Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, and a separate count for the unborn Nico. He also pleaded guilty to unlawful termination of pregnancy. Because Colorado had abolished the death penalty at the time, he was sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. He will die in prison. In January 2019, Watts gave a lengthy interview to FBI agents and investigators, a conversation that became known as the Sermon on the Porch, transcript by the true crime community. In that interview, he finally dropped the story about Shanann harming the girls. He described, in chilling detail, what he'd done and how he'd done it. He also said Nickel Kessinger had nothing to do with it. She had, by that point, already spoken to investigators and cooperated fully. She later gave an interview where she described feeling sick and violated, saying she had no idea who Chris Watts really was. and that she believed he'd been lying to her as thoroughly as he'd been lying to everyone else. Shanann's family, her parents, Frank and Sandra Rzucek, have spent the years since their daughter's death advocating for victims of domestic violence and family annihilation. Her brother Frankie has spoken publicly about the family's grief, about what it means to lose a daughter, a sister, and 2 grandchildren all at once. There's a memorial for Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. People leave flowers there. People who never met them. Just strangers who felt the weight of this story and needed somewhere to put it. Here's what makes the Chris Watts case so deeply disturbing and so important to talk about. Shanann posted about her marriage. She posted about her life. She had hundreds of thousands of followers watching her every day. And not one single person, not her friends, not her parents, not her social media audience, saw what was really happening inside that house. Because Chris Watts was careful. He was strategic in the way quiet people can be strategic. He didn't hit her. He didn't threaten her publicly. He just slowly, silently checked out while presenting a smiling face to the world. There were signs. There are almost always signs. The sudden emotional distance, the unexplained absences, the way someone who used to be fully present starts feeling like a stranger in their own home. Those things are easy to dismiss as going through a rough patch. They're easy to explain away, but sometimes, not always, not usually, but sometimes, they are the warning. The truth about domestic violence and intimate partner homicide is that it rarely looks like the movies. It doesn't always come with shouting and black eyes and police reports. Sometimes it looks like a man in khaki shorts mowing his lawn on a Tuesday morning while his family is already gone. Shanann Watts was 34 years old. She was fierce, funny, loud in the best possible way, deeply loved by her kids, and building a life she was proud of. Bella was 4, Celeste was 3. Nico never got the chance to take a single breath outside of his mother's womb. None of them deserved what happened to them, and the least we can do, all of us who keep returning to these stories, who stay up too late listening to cases like this one, is to actually learn something from them, to look a little closer, to trust our gut when something feels off, to check on our friends, to believe people when they tell us they're struggling, because sometimes the scariest thing isn't the stranger, it's the person standing in the driveway, smiling at the camera, telling the whole world he just wants his family back home. If this story hit different for you, if it made you think, made you feel, made you want to understand the world a little better, then hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear these stories. And if you're new here, subscribe. We cover true crime exactly like this. No sensationalism, no exploitation, just the full story, told straight, with the respect these victims deserve. Every single week, there's a new case dropping soon that I promise you have never heard told this way. You don't want to miss it. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and look out for the people around you.